where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives on George Samueli. It is now, well, 9:18 p.m. in, yes, a kind of coldish city of Budapest, where I have to admit the sun is peeking out and promising maybe spring around the corner. I wouldn't bank on it, but nonetheless, that's what it was today. So I'll, acknowledge it that today was actually quite a nice day. So, but on that, I guess partially optimistic note, welcome everybody who has joined me. Really appreciate you being here for the Tuesday night edition of the live stream. And of course, there's a number of things to talk about because today, of course, is the State of the Union Day. And so we can anticipate that. That will start 9 p.m. East Coast time, so middle of the night here, 3 a.m. here. But of course, as you all know, today is also the fourth anniversary of the war in Ukraine, or as Russia insists on calling it, the fourth anniversary of the launch of Russia's special military operation. Now, if you recall during those days, the days of 2022, while I did think that Russia had quite a strong case, that Russia had been boxed in by the NATO powers through their relentless expansion and through their obvious determination to induct Ukraine into NATO, into deploying NATO forces in Ukraine, to deploying NATO missiles in Ukraine. And that would be just then preliminary to NATO's seizure of Belarus, and thereby ensuring that essentially Russia is completely surrounded by NATO states, completely boxed in all through on its western borders, through to the south, southwest, and that NATO would continue with its expansion into the Caucasus, into Central Asia, and essentially Russia would cease to be any kind of a power at all, since it will be completely surrounded by NATO. No country on earth, no power on earth could possibly tolerate anything like that. It's never happened before, and it would obviously be totally unacceptable to any Russian leader. So I did think that Russia needed to do something. Russia needed to break out of this encirclement. That's what it was. It's encirclement of Russia. It had been a long time planning. It had been launched really from the moment that Gorbachev essentially brought the Soviet Union to an end. That from then on, NATO began this policy of encirclement, and this was a long-standing policy of Western powers, essentially to degrade, diminish, encircle, and ultimately destroy and exploit Russia. This is long-standing. It's been going for centuries. There was nothing new about it. Gorbachev, through his folly, had opened Russia up to this essentially Western onslaught. So Putin had to do something. Now, the difficulty was, what would Russia need to do? Because if Russia sits on its hands, as it sat on its hands or was unable to do anything during all the various waves of NATO expansion, from the first one in 1999, and then through the big one in 2004, and then through these successive waves of NATO expansion. If Russia sits on its hands, then, as I said, Russia ceases to be any kind of a significant power. I mean, it just it's just basically it's surrounded by enemies, and therefore it would just simply be a matter of time before NATO states would not just be content to sit there encircling Russia. They would begin to launch insurgencies inside Russia, trying to exploit the various indigenous people, trying to exploit religious differences, national differences, ethnic differences. We know, we know what NATO's up to. We know what the Western powers are doing. It was just a matter of time. Once Russia was encircled, then absolutely NATO would launch campaigns in order to destroy Russia, as of course they did during the 1990s when they were quite heavily involved in the war in Chechnya. So therefore, that Russia felt that it had to do something in 2022 was obvious. The question then was, well, what do you do? And I thought that the principle of launching some kind of a military operation, a preemptive attack, in a way that Stalin launched these various military operations in anticipation of the Hitlerian attack of 1941, made sense. To create some kind of a buffer zone, or at least make sure that Ukraine could not become a member of NATO. So Ukraine could not become a member of NATO. That means Belarus could not become a member of NATO. And then Russia would therefore have some kind of a protection, a buffer zone between itself and NATO. So I thought that was an absolutely a sensible policy. Now the question then was, well, how do you bring this about? And I think here it became obvious fairly early on that the way Russia was fighting this war was not likely to yield any successful results. Um, the key was basically the most important goal that Russia needed to accomplish, which is the goals that the Soviet Union had accomplished in 1956 in Hungary, in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, in 1981 in Poland. What the goals that they needed to accomplish was regime change. They had to get some kind of a government in Kiev that would be willing to, at the very least, maintain a policy of neutrality and a policy of rejection of joining any military alliances, of a rejection of hosting um, armed forces on its territory, any armed forces on its territory by other powers. That's what that meaning with the had. So, we can have all kinds of um, discussions about why Russia was asleep at the switch during the Yanukovych years, because with Yanukovych, really Russia had everything that it wanted. It had a leader there who, whatever his shortcomings, he's corrupt, not corrupt. I'm not very interested. He probably was corrupt, but either way, it had a leader in Kiev who ran on the platform in 2010 of Ukrainian neutrality. Ukrainian neutrality, which means that Ukraine would not join any military alliances. It would not be a part of NATO. It would not form a military alliance with Russia, and therefore, be friend to all, but a military ally to none. And that was Yanukovych ran on that platform in 2010, and Yanukovych won that election. And from that moment on, it was really up to Russia to ensure that Yanukovych stayed in power. which is why where I was really baffled was when um, during Maidan, which was obviously, I mean, obviously, anybody with half a brain would have known this is a NATO inspired insurrection against Yanukovych. Just remember, Yanukovych, his election, he was robbed of that election winning. He won the election in 2004, clearly a fraud. By having a third round of voting. I mean, have you ever heard of a third round of voting? A third round of voting, which finally ensured his defeat. But either Yanukovych, 2004, and then we had the disastrous Yushchenko, Timoshenko years, and then Yanukovych comes back in 2010, and that was the moment when essentially Russia had an ally in Kiev. That's all they could have hoped for. To have somebody like Yanukovych in Kiev. Now, it was obvious, should have been obvious to anyone. Of course, from the beginning, there was going to be a plan to get rid of him, to push him out. I mean, they took the presidency away from him in 2004, and of course, they were going to take the presidency away from him again. Hence, Maidan, which came about through this phony, baloney, nonsensical issue of Yanukovych refusing to agree to the EU Ukraine Association Agreement. Now, Yanukovych didn't actually refuse to sign the agreement. He just wanted a better deal. So he said he was going to postpone the signing of the deal, which is kind of what presidents do. He said, hey, I don't think we've got a good deal yet. I'm going to hold off signing. And this, of course, led to the protests and so on. And then we had this went on through the winter months of 2013, 2014. And here's the mystery then why Russia did so little to support Yanukovych. Because, it was fairly obvious what the plan was. But strangely enough, Russia didn't do very much to support him. And in fact, if anything, Russia was taking an even-handed approach as between Yanukovych and the Maidan, and an even-handed approach as between Yanukovych and the NATO powers. So Putin joined Angela Merkel in calling for restraint on both sides. Restraint on both sides. Well, you don't have restraint on both sides. I mean, there was an obvious attempt to overthrow the government. If you have restraint on the part of the government, then that government is going to fall, which is exactly what happened with Yanukovych. Now, then of course we have, Russia responded, Crimea and so on. But still, at that moment, it still seems strange why Putin and the Kremlin would have believed that the Western powers were going to agree to anything like the Minsk deal. I mean, of course they were going to. The prize was Ukraine. I mean, they Victoria Nuland and the rest of them had spelled this out over and over. The prize is Ukraine. And instead, it went on and on, these various Minsk and then the agreements. And then we have to keep in mind that Putin himself refused to incorporate. At that moment, he refused to incorporate into the Russian Federation the oblasts of Donetsk and Lugansk. They had a vote on it in 2014. They wanted to join Russia. Putin said no. And no doubt Putin said, well, we were being reasonable, we were hoping for some kind of a settlement and so on. But there was never going to be any kind of a settlement. The prize was Ukraine, the whole of Ukraine. And eventually, of course, because by 2014, Russia had incorporated Crimea into the federation. So the prize was eventually to take back Crimea. So, you'd have to say that between 2014 and 2022, Russia just dawdled. I don't know what it was doing, Russia thought it was doing, but didn't accomplish anything very much between 2014 and 2022. Because during those years, Ukraine grew stronger and stronger. As it was obvious that they were going stronger and stronger, and NATO boasted that it was providing arms for Ukraine. They were building up their defenses. They were building up their fortifications. And so what wasn't accomplished in 2014 was going to be much more difficult to accomplish years later. I mean, Ukraine was just, by 2022, Ukraine was not the same power as it was in 2014, as should have been obvious. Now, so then the question is, okay, we now, fast forward to February 2022. And my view at the time was that you need to get this thing over and done with very quickly. And because the longer a war goes on, the more uncertainties and the more other powers are going to get involved, and the more the balance of forces is going to develop against you. So if you're going to launch a military operation, you have to do it quickly, you have to do it brutally, you have to do it ruthlessly, and you have to know exactly what you're accomplishing. So when I go back to 56, 68, and 1980, what was it the Soviet Union was accomplishing? The Soviet Union was accomplishing regime change. They had a problem in Hungary in 56 that the communist regime was essentially collapsing. And instead of the communist regime, they were going to get an anti-communist regime. So Imre Nagy was simply the transitional figure. Nagy himself was a communist, but Nagy was a rather weak, indecisive figure, and he would be obviously swept aside in no time at all. But at that moment, Nagy was the problem, because Nagy was just allowing communism to disintegrate in Hungary. So, the Soviets sent massive force into Hungary, removed Nagy, had a government in place, which was namely Kádár, and then essentially, put Nagy on trial, executed him, and executed some of his followers. It caused a lot of bitterness for a while. Hungarians lost their lives, and they were very unhappy for a number of years. But life goes on, and eventually, life improved for Hungarians. And the Hungarians, but whatever their feelings about 56, they did realize that with Kádár, they had actually quite a reasonable leader, and Kádár was able to achieve some form of reconciliation with the Hungarian people. But above all, he also managed to maintain good relations with the Soviet leaders. So so that was they did that in 56. It was a regime change, a brutal application of force, execution of the leaders that they thought had basically betrayed the Soviet interests. But so something similar happened in '68 with in Czechoslovakia. Also, regime change, uh, massive use of force. Um, the Czechoslovak leaders were, of course, arrested, kidnapped, shipped to Moscow. Read the Riot Act by the Soviet leaders, forced to sign a declaration that they intended to change their ways, and then they were sent back to Prague. And when they went back to Prague, they said, "Yep, we are going to change our ways. We are going to bring to an end the Prague Spring," and they, which is what they did. And of course, in no time at all, they removed all of those leaders and put in much more reliable leaders in Prague. Poland was a little bit different. I mean, each case, the Soviets showed a certain flexibility. Each time was a little different. Hungary was a much more brutal application of force. Czechoslovakia was an application of force, but it was a bit more subtle. Poland, they did the thing with the martial law, and essentially had the military taking over, and the military then removing solidarity. Um, and so that was it. Now, something you have to think that Putin, who of course lived through those days and obviously remember those days well, Putin had something along similar in mind for Ukraine. But if you are unable to accomplish a coup, you can't do a color revolution. Russia didn't have the means at hand to accomplish the overthrow of Zelensky via color revolution, so they had to apply force. Then you have to apply it, let's say, fairly ruthlessly, and the key would have been to eliminate all Ukrainian means of defense. In other words, prior to sending in your troops, you knock out all of Ukraine's air force. You knock out all of Ukraine's air defenses. You knock out all of Ukraine's military industrial capabilities. You knock out Ukraine's infrastructure. You knock out Ukraine's communications, Ukraine's energy grid. You knock out everything that would enable Ukraine to put up any kind of effective resistance to incoming Russian forces, which is how the United States has always operated. I mean, that's how the United States operated when it attacked Iraq in 2003. Before you send in your forces, you destroy Iraq's military capabilities. Because if you don't, then you're essentially sending in your forces into a meat grinder. And that's exactly what happened. Russia sent in its forces into a meat grinder. Moreover, Russia really didn't send in anything like an adequate force, adequate numbers of forces to take Kiev, because that's the source of the problem. The source of the problem, as it was in Hungary in '56, as it was in Prague in '68. Your source of your problem is in the capital, where you have a government that is not playing ball with you. But Russia did send in its forces to Kiev, but it just didn't have anything like the numbers that would be necessary to take Kiev and to seize the leaders in Kiev and force them to some kind of an accommodation. Sort of the Prague model. You force them to sign some declaration. Whatever. Basically, the declaration was neutrality. Once that was not accomplished, then the balance of forces were just no longer in Russia's favor. And so that it still remains a mystery to me why, prior to launching this attack to take Kiev, why Russia didn't destroy as much of Ukraine's military capabilities as it could. All of the airfields, all of the aircraft, all of the air defense systems, all of your communication systems, all of your energy infrastructure system, all of it. So that when the Russian forces then arrive, you know, the Ukrainian government says we don't really have any means to defend ourselves. NATO is not coming in on our behalf. We don't have any means at all. Let's do a deal. Once that didn't happen, and once NATO had time to recover from the initial shock of the invasion, then gradually it would, the balance of forces would, at least, I wouldn't necessarily turn against Russia, but at least it would enable Ukraine to recover, and it would enable NATO to begin this massive operation to help Kiev. And that was always obvious to me at the time. So that's why, as I was saying, what I was saying at the time. If Russia doesn't get this done quickly, then essentially NATO is going to go in a very big way and provide great a deal of assistance, support, financing for Kiev. Because all NATO has to do is to keep this war going. So by the time that we had the negotiations, first in Minsk, and then in Istanbul in 2022, the NATO powers had figured that essentially Russia had missed the bus, that Russia had an opportunity to wrap it up quickly in February 2022, but by April, which is when the negotiations in Istanbul were taking place, by April 2022, Russia had missed the bus, which is why the agreement that Russia, has been touting since then, and say, well, we had already initialed this agreement, and Zelensky had initialed this agreement, but this agreement was not at all favorable to Russia. I mean, it did put limits on Ukraine's armed forces, but on all of the other issues, the territorial issues, essentially, they were left up in the air. They would be dealt with at later negotiations. So when Boris Johnson famously went to Kiev in April of 2022, he saw, well, like, hey, it looks to me that Russia is suing for peace. Russia had launched this attack, but now it's suing for peace. So we've got Russia on the run. And if we have Russia on the run, then maybe we can ensure a historic change in the balance of forces on the Eurasian continent. We can deal with the Russian problem once and for all. The British have been trying to eliminate Russia as any kind of a power for centuries. And of course, Boris Johnson would have seized on this opportunity. Why wouldn't he? So from that moment on, the war was really set. It was going to go on for a very long time. Now, we can say, okay, well, but Russia is much bigger than Ukraine. Its population. I mean, its population is 4 or 5 times as bigger than Ukraine. Yes, its military is much bigger than that of Ukraine. Yes, has a military-industrial complex larger than that of Ukraine. Yes, but all of those things can be addressed by the intervention of NATO. Because if it's Russia versus Ukraine, Russia wins pretty easily. Obviously, if you compare Ukraine's resources, Russia wins, right? But if it's Russia and Ukraine and NATO, then of course it becomes very different. Because really, if you throw in all of the NATO countries who are not actually going to be directly involved in the fighting themselves, but nonetheless are going to be providing financing and support, arming and everything. And then you've got all of the various NATO aligned countries around the world, then of course it becomes a very different um, equation in the kind of in the war of attrition. So that's why, whenever I talk like this over the past 4 years, and those people criticize me and say, "Well, you don't understand the war. It's attrition. It's attrition, attrition, attrition." Okay, yeah, it's attrition. Russia versus Ukraine. Russia wins the war of attrition. Russia versus NATO, it becomes a very different kind of a war. And it's clear now that NATO has no interest or incentive to bring this thing to an end. I mean, I think we had the moment of Trump, and I think Russians did have some hope for Trump, not because they thought that Trump was particularly pro-Russian, and he's not, but that Trump was preoccupied by the conflict with China. So Trump would figure that that America's main adversary is China, and therefore it makes no sense for the West to push Russia and China together, because then the United States has to deal with Russia and China together. So it would make sense for the United States to try to split Russia and China up. Since Russia is the weaker of the two, we'll just simply prize Russia away from China. The kind of reverse of the Nixon policy of the 1970s of the two, Soviet Union and China. China was the weaker of the two, and so the United States tried to prize China away from the Soviet Union. And I think that was that was the calculation in the Kremlin, that they thought, well, that's what Trump is going to want to do. Trump was going to want to end this war because he didn't think there was made any sense for the United States to drive Russia and China together. What I think Russia was not figuring out is that as Trump sees it, he doesn't really think Russia is such a big player in the world. He just doesn't think that it matters a great deal for the United States, one way or another, whether Russia is with China or whether Russia is not with China. I think that's his calculation. Now, Trump Trump gets a lot of things wrong, and I was saying that's his that's the correct analysis. But I think that is the way Trump is thinking. He thinks it doesn't really matter, and he's kind of lost interest in trying to bring this war to an end. I mean, yes, he's applied some pressure on Zelensky, but it's a half-hearted sort of pressure. The only thing that he's concerned about is he doesn't want the United States to be involved in financing Ukraine. So he says, yeah, we'll provide arms, we'll provide intelligence, but the Europeans need to pay for the arms. That's all. He hasn't said that he's going to stop the flow of arms. He just says need to pay for these arms. So I think that option, I think, is off the table. I think any hope that Trump would somehow apply pressure on the Europeans or apply pressure on Ukraine to bring this to an end, I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think, I mean, I don't know what the Russians are thinking. It seems like they're still trying to entice Trump with all kinds of possibilities of big, big economic, financial deals between Russia and the United States. I mean, that hence the role of Dmitriev, who's there having these chats with Witkoff and Jared. All these great projects that we can work on together. But Trump isn't really that interested in this. He'd like to see investment in the United States if you can pour some money into the United States, but I don't think he sees huge um, benefits to pouring money into Russia or Ukraine until after the war is over. But until then, there's not a particularly enticing prospect. All right, so that I think option is on the table. So what happens now? Well, if one looks at it, objectively, then it's clear NATO does not have the strength to defeat Russia. It's not going to defeat Russia. But by the same token, as things stand, Russia does not have the strength to defeat NATO in Ukraine. That if we can continue fighting like this year after year. I mean, it's not going to come to an end. At this rate, it is not going to come to an end. The talk about how Russia is going to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk later on this year. I mean, it's just there's no basis for these sort of predictions. Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are heavily fortified, and Russia just doesn't have the forces there to take heavily fortified cities. That just the numbers are not there for this. And we've seen these advances, and none of the advances that we've read about. And Russia has made advances. There's no question. Yeah, it's taken more territory and taken more territory. But in themselves, that doesn't necessarily mean any great strategic gains. Yeah, you can take a village after village. You can take communities, whatever. But you have to take key strategic nodes, and then once you've taken them, you have to be able to use that as a bridgehead for a massive advance against your enemy. That's how wars have always been won. Which is, yeah, you take a key strategic point, but the only point, the only reason to take such a strategic bridgehead is if you're able to exploit that and use that in order to send in your massive infantry. If you don't, then it's just meaningless. I mean, you took this, but it's meaningless without the without being able to you know you to advance your forces towards your objective, and your objective is clearly the removal of this government in Kiev. So taking some village in Donetsk, that's not going to get you there. So as things stand, this could go on for a long time. Now, if it goes on for a long time, then again, there's all sorts of problems along the way, because we're now seeing how NATO is doing its calculations. It's obviously it's continuing to provide missiles to Kiev, missiles, drones, or whatever, but they're helping Kiev to build essentially its own capabilities, its own military-industrial complex, using NATO um, industry, infrastructure, and components. So essentially, within a year or 2 years, Ukraine will be building its own quite sophisticated missiles. I mean, they'll be using NATO components, but they will be built in Ukraine. And using these missiles, they're going to be able to attack um, key Russian targets. What are these key Russian targets? Well, they're going to attack Russian energy infrastructure. They're already doing that. They're going to keep hitting Russia's oil refineries, Russia's oil storage depots. They're going to be hitting Russia's energy industry infrastructure. They're doing it now. They're hitting the oil pipelines in Tatarstan. They're hitting oil refineries everywhere, and with that, of course, that's they're hitting Russia's source of revenue. Then they're going to start attacking Russia's military-industrial complex. They're going to be hitting Russia's military factories, those giant military factories. They're a long way away from Ukraine, but with missiles, with drones, they're absolutely reachable, and they're already doing it. Even Scott Ritter, who's obviously been a big booster for Russia. Even Scott Ritter is saying, yeah, this is a serious business. This hitting Russia's military factories, that's gonna make a big difference. So that's obviously going to be happening. And of course, the other thing that's obviously going to be happening is the seizure of these various oil tankers. There's going to be a lot of that. And seizing these oil tankers is really very easy to do, because there are an awful lot of these oil tankers out in the seas, and Russia does not have the naval resources to protect all of the oil tankers. So you can just go seize them on any Mickey Mouse pretext of saying, "Oh, well, they're in violation of international maritime law. They haven't done the proper paperwork." You can just seize them. There's nothing Russia can do about it, unless, of course, Russia is ready to do the same thing and to start seizing Western ships, start seizing British ships. Russia can't. The naval resources don't exist to protect every single ship in international waters. So the only thing you can do is to seize British and French and German, but they're not going to seize American ships. So, the Russians are wary of provoking the Americans. So that was one mean, but the point about seizing ships is that it creates uncertainty in the energy markets. It creates rising costs of doing business, because then the insurance rates are going to go through the roof when ships really don't know what's going to happen to them, and anyone who's venturing a tanker into the seas is taking his life in his hands, and so insurance rates are going to spike, and that will eat into Russia's energy earnings. So that I think clearly is on the card. So attacks on Russian oil or energy infrastructure, absolutely. Oil refineries, oil storage depots, gas pipes. I mean, all of that's going to be come under attack, and then the ships. They're obviously going to be seized. All right. So given that, what can Russia do? Now, we can take off the table. We'll talk about the nuclear weapons. I know they bring up we've got nukes and nukes. I mean, it's not going to happen. Russia's not going to use nuclear weapons. It's uh, it's just foolish talk. No, nuclear weapons are completely useless as weapons of war because if you use them against a power that also has nuclear weapons, then you're going to get hit yourself. So then you're going to essentially subject your own people to a nuclear attack, and no one wants to do that. That's not going to happen. But the only thing that I think could change the equation is if Russia then orders a full mobilization and then decides that this is the only way it can accomplish its goals, which means it has to make its advantage in population, its advantage in resources count. Because at the moment, it's not making anything count. Because the number of Russians forces fighting in Ukraine is about the same as the number of Ukrainian forces fighting in Ukraine. So there's basically even themselves out, and therefore you can't. There's no way you can win a war when it's the same numbers on each side. You just reach, what we have now. But if you mobilize and no longer depend on essentially volunteers who go to the front, in exchange for a nice signing bonus, then the balance of forces could change, and then you would have the forces necessary to accomplish your goals, which I think in this case is really no real option but to take Kiev. I think that's would be the only way that things could change. Other than that, we then continue along the same lines, and that in a year's time, when we're talking about the 5-year anniversary, and that's 5 years, that's always being 5-year anniversary, will be exactly the same thing. We'll be in this exactly the same position because we were in the same position a year ago, and a year ago, to be honest, not that much has changed over the past 12 months. Ukraine is not on the brink of collapse. I think we can say that. I think in all the interviews Zelensky has given, he has given no indication that Ukraine's on the brink of collapse or that he has any interest in coming to any kind of an agreement. On the contrary, he is making clear that he intends to fight on and that he doesn't want to make any concessions. The various concessions that Trump has urged on him, he's saying, nah, not interested. Not interested in making any territorial concessions. Not interested in making any concessions about security guarantees, whatever they are. It's just not interested in that. All right. So then, as I say, I think the only way things I think could change, since there's as I say, Russia's not on the brink of collapse. The economy is not on the brink of collapse. It's not doing great, but it's not on the brink of collapse. But Ukraine's not on the brink of collapse. So unless Russia makes its advantage in its human resources count, then I think the war goes on, and the longer the war goes on, the more problematic it will become for Russia. And above all, the more likely it is that NATO will be much stronger. Within 2 or 3 years, NATO will be much stronger than it is now, as more and more the powers in NATO start to mobilize, start to build up their armed forces, start to build up their military industries, which is already happening, start to spend a lot more on their military. So by 2030, Russia will be facing a very strong NATO. The NATO powers they keep talking about. Well, we're going to be ready for this. Or, we're afraid of Russia attacking us in 2030. What does that mean? It means we are planning on entering the war against Russia in 2030, and they are. And I think that is the plan. By 2030, they're figuring that Russia will already be sufficiently weakened that the NATO powers could enter and directly involved in the war against Russia. So that's why I think Russia needs to wrap this up. I mean, I said it then, I said it 2022. You got to wrap it up quickly. So they got to wrap it up now, and therefore just make its um, uh, to count. Anyway, so that's the on that. The other thing that I want to talk about is what is going on with and which is what we're all really wondering, which is um, the will he, won't he? Will Trump launch this attack on Iran or not? And so, I mean, obviously we've talked a great deal about Trump, and uh, he still, has left up in the air what exactly he's trying to accomplish in Iran. Nobody really knows. And I know, simple explanation. Oh yeah, well, he's just trying to achieve regime change. Well, the problem with that thesis is that Trump has never said that. Trump has never outlined that as a goal of his. Trump has never been a particular, Zionist shill. He has never said he wants to return to some kind of a pre Islamic Republic government in Tehran. Um, so that's to me, it's just always just a kind of a lazy way of presenting. Oh, of course he wants regime change. Yeah, Mark Levin wants regime change, but that isn't what Trump wants. Now he, back in his first term, he talked about the renegotiating or redoing the JCPOA, and that's what he did. If you recall, from 2017 to 2018, he worked on the JCPOA, and essentially to try to step away from it, which he finally did. But with a view to what? Well, as Trump explained, well, with a view to we'll get a better deal. Well, of course, he didn't get a better deal. And the hapless Biden administration, which had an opportunity essentially to return to the JCPOA, didn't do anything. It just dawdled, had some, conducted some meaningless negotiations. I think they took place in Vienna. It went on for a while. But Biden did not return to the JCPOA, and then Trump in 2016, 2024, he again runs on a platform of no more forever wars, no more regime change wars. We're going to get away from the Bush Cheney years, and we're going to focus on domestic affairs. That was it. He never promised either in 2016 or in 2024 that he would move against the against Iran. He never promised that. That was never part of the platform, and he managed to get the sort of anti-war, non-interventionist onto his side, and so it was a kind of I think a little surprising when during his first few months in office, he suddenly returned to the Iran issue. But he returned to the Iran issue again on this issue of the Iran must not have nuclear weapons. And so then nuclear weapons, and then we have the negotiations in Oman, and it seemed as if there was a deal to be had, because remember, during the years in which the United States had walked away from the JCPOA, Iran had continued to enrich uranium. It probably was not a good idea. It's understandable why Iran should have done it. There was an agreement on the table, everyone signed it with the JCPOA. Iran was allowed to enrich uranium up to about 3.2% or whatever. I think it was something like that. And then the United States walks away, and but in theory, the JCPOA was still, in effect. But the United States imposed sanctions, or returned to the sanctions policy, and then Trump, immediately upon walking out of the JCPOA, adopted the maximum pressure campaign. Now, the Iranians expected the Europeans, the E3, which is France, Germany, and the UK, to step into the breach and to counter the effect of the restoration of the U.S. sanctions, as it was supposed to be. That was how it was outlined in the JCPOA. That if anyone walks out, and we all know who this anyone was, there was always a suspicion that the United States would walk away from it. But if anyone does walk away from it, then the other parties to the agreement would make up for any losses. Well, that didn't happen, and I think Iran then responded by enriching uranium, and step by step, it went up, 20%, whatever, and eventually got up to 60%. Now, obviously, that wasn't a great idea for Iran to do. It's understandable why they did it, but it wasn't a great idea, because by moving towards 60% enrichment, there was always the danger that the Republicans, whether Trump or anyone else, the Republicans would return to power in Washington and would immediately point to the danger of Iran and say, "Oh, look, Iran, they're close to having a nuclear weapons. They got 60%. It's a 60% enrichment." Which is, of course, what happened. And I think any Republican, who would be in power, would point to the 60% enrichment as saying Iran poses a threat. Now, that was then, and nonetheless, in 2021 or 2025, when Trump returned to office, the Iranians were obviously ready to negotiate something. I say, well, okay, yes, we understand 60% is unacceptable to you, and we'll negotiate, it down considerably. But obviously, we want some incentives as well, such as the lifting of sanctions, and so there were negotiations that were taking place in Oman, and then Israel was obviously very unhappy about all of this. And of course, then Israel launched its attack, and then the United States joined in. Now, this is where it gets a little murky because, of course, there will be those who will argue, well, of course, Israel and the United States, it was all a trick, and they were working in tandem, and the whole thing was planned, and so on. That may be true. We haven't had confirmation of this, but it's quite possible that Israel and the United States were working a kind of a double act, enticing Iran into negotiations with to put them at their ease, and then to launch an attack. I'm not sure that that's the case, to be honest. But all right, let's just go with it. Let's say that is what happened. Um, However, what Trump did in his attacks in June was at least consistent with what he had been insisting on before, which was that Iran cannot have any capabilities to enrich uranium. Now, I'm not justifying that. I'm not saying that's a sound policy. Iran enriching uranium was acting in accordance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 does not prohibit any country from enriching uranium as long as it is for peaceful means. Iran has insisted it's exclusively for peaceful means, and there's simply no reason whatever to disbelieve their claims. Just because Israel says, "Oh well, obviously then it's not for peaceful means." Well, they've never, there's no evidence that they have, aggressive intent, that they intend to use nuclear weapons against anybody, or indeed, a more basic point, or indeed that they intend to develop nuclear weapons. Though one should say, they would certainly be. It would be understandable were they to develop nuclear weapons, because, of course, they're up against Israel, which is a nuclear weapon state, and of course they have a very hostile United States constantly threatening them, and of course the United States is a nuclear power, so it would be perfectly understandable why Iran would want to have nuclear weapons. Much like when India developed nuclear weapons, it was obviously a matter of time before Pakistan also developed nuclear weapons, because the two are sort of deadly enemies, and they're not going to allow one to have nuclear weapons and the other one not to have nuclear weapons. So it would have been understandable, but nonetheless, Iran said that it is not interested in developing nuclear weapons. So Trump launches this attack in June of 2025, and then Trump boasts, endlessly about how he's completely destroyed Iran's nuclear capability, destroyed their centrifuges, everything is buried, destroyed, boom, that's it, gone. Which is why, it's very puzzling that Trump has now relaunched his campaign against Iran. But the particular oddity of it is his insistence that it's still on the issue is the same. No nuclear weapons for Iran, having said repeatedly that he has destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities with his attack in June. He now says, "Well, I've built it. I've put together this huge armada, within the vicinity of Iran, in order to coerce some kind of a deal out of Iran, which means no nuclear weapons." Now, you have to then obviously you say, well, what's behind this? Well, obviously Israel's behind this because there's no way in which anything that Iran does poses any kind of a threat to the United States. But Israel, that's a different case because, of course, Israel does consider um, Iran's ballistic missiles to be a threat. Well, obviously, Israel is within reach of the ballistic missiles. And Israel would like to see the elimination of the clerical government in Tehran. I mean, Israel would like to see the breakup and disintegration of Iran. Let's just as if you ask, well, what is NATO's ultimate goal in Russia? Yeah, the disintegration of Russia, just the complete collapse and breakup of the country into warring factions, and a civil war that's going to roil the state for decades to come. That would be that's NATO's model for Russia. That's what they would like to see, and that's what Israel would like to see in Iran. Um, is that what Trump wants? Well, if it is, he hasn't spelt this out. It would seem to be a very reckless policy, but okay. I mean, that maybe that's what the United States wants. That clearly that's what the United States wanted in Syria, what it wanted in Libya. So maybe that the United States decided, well, it's to America's advantage to have Iran just collapse into civil war, which could go on for years. But again, Trump hasn't um, said anything like that. And if he does go there, well, it could have all sorts of very unfortunate consequences. I mean, Iran's a big country. If it's a population of 92 million, and if a country of 92 million collapses, we you know we have yet we don't know all of the appalling consequences that could flow from it. So there have been some media reports in the last few days that members of the U.S. military are getting cold feet about this project of Trump's of launching attacks without any clear objectives. It's just a simple, not at all. The military don't know what it is Trump is hoping to accomplish. So there was one article. First of all, there was an article in Axios, and which was quite interesting. Here we are, and here's the headline. You can see Trump's top general warns of Iran's strike risks, and then here we have this Dan Kane. Trump's always going on about raising Kane. Dan Kane has been advising President blah blah, and he says it could carry significant risks. In particular, the possibility of becoming entangled in a prolonged conflict, and then there's an ongoing debate at the top levels of the Trump administration about how to handle the Iran standoff and what the consequences of each option would be. At the moment, several of the voices in Trump's circle are urging caution, though some sources think Trump himself is leaning towards a strike. And then, just as with the planning for the operation to capture Nicolas Maduro, Trump has empowered a small brain trust to think through problems in Iran and present him with a range of options he can exercise at the time of his choosing that maximizes leverage and minimizes risk. While Kane was all in on the Venezuela operation, he has been more cautious in the discussions around Iran. Citing that contrast, one source described Kane as a reluctant warrior on Iran. A reluctant warrior on Iran. Kane sees the stakes of a major operation in Iran as higher, with a greater risk for entanglement and American casualties. One source said Kane was not advocating for a strike, but will support and execute any decision Trump makes. Well, of course he is. I mean, we have what's known as civilian leadership. Yeah, so the president orders a strike. Of course, he was going to support it. Another source with direct knowledge of Kane's thinking said the chairman is not skeptical about a military campaign, but clear-eyed and realistic about the chances for success and about what could come next after war starts. A senior official also denied Kane had expressed skepticism. Okay. And then Kane has been the only military leader briefing Trump in recent weeks on Iran. CENTCOM commander Admiral Brad Cooper hasn't been invited to the meetings Trump convened on Iran and hasn't spoken to the president since the crisis started in early January. Cooper's predecessor, General Eric Kurilla, briefed both Trump and former President Biden on Iran, and then again, Trump hasn't spoken to it. Okay, and then Vice President Vance has also raised concerns about entanglement during internal deliberations in recent days. One source confirmed the VP has been raising questions about the risks and complexity of the operation with military and national security officials, but denied he was outright opposed to striking Iran. And then Vance hopes the talks in Geneva on Thursday. Remember, there's going to be another round of talks in Geneva. Will produce a diplomatic breakthrough, but is not optimistic about the odds of a deal. And then he's presenting information on both sides of the argument to help the president make an informed decision. And then, meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been sitting on the fence. Well, that's interesting. Rubio, usually a war hawk, has been sitting on the fence rather than advocating strongly for or against a strike. Rubio has historically been hawkish on Iran, but he has been focusing more of his energy in recent weeks on Venezuela and Cuba. All right, so that's kind of interesting there, because Rubio is indeed a war hawk, and if it's true that he's sitting on the fence, then one has to assume Rubio is making calculations. Now, we got to. My view is that if there are going to be strikes on Iran, then I don't think Iran has the capability to inflict any great damage on the United States. I think the U.S. technological prowess and U.S. technological superiority over a relatively poor country like Iran is just so great that that I don't think Iran can inflict huge damage to U.S. bases or U.S. Military capabilities in the region. But that may not be enough, because so that's why I'm just I'm kind of dismissive of the people who say Iran's going to inflict great damage. In fact, Iran's going to defeat the United States. I mean, we can ignore all of that. But Iran doesn't necessarily have to accomplish those goals. Doesn't have to inflict huge damage on the United States. Iran only has to inflict limited damage. Iran only has to kill some American servicemen, just to destroy some American property, for this war to blow up in Trump's face. Because it's a war of choice. And if you start a war of choice and you haven't really explained to the public what you're trying to accomplish, and now suddenly Americans are dead, then that war is yours. those dead Americans are your responsibility. And it's particularly irksome when it's the responsibility of a man who promised that he would keep America out of wars, who deliberately um, said, "Oh, no more of these forever wars, no more regime change wars, no more Bush Cheney, no more neocons." So if you made that promise, and now suddenly you elected to attack a country on a pretext that nobody actually can quite figure out, and now Americans are dead, then it's on you. So I think that is probably what Iran is calculating. It said, well, we're going to inflict some pain, some damage on the United States, and that would be enough to cause some kind of a collapse of support within the United States for this military venture. I don't know. I don't know if that's what will happen, but I don't really see Iran as having much choice on the matter. I think Iran really cannot cave to America and Israel, because if you cave now, then they're going to ask you to cave again in 3 months' time. Maybe in 2 months' time. It's just they're going to keep asking you to cave and cave and cave. So Iran can't afford to cave. So I think Iran's strategy at this stage is we have to inflict whatever pain we can on the United States and see what effect this will have on the U.S. government, and particularly on Trump. So really, the bar is quite low for Iran. It doesn't have to win any war. It just has to inflict pain on the United States, and that I think is doable. Now, it may be, and maybe that's what the generals are thinking. That's what Kane is thinking. Hey, I mean, they could accomplish this, and then we got a real problem on our hands. We're entangled in an unpopular war with seeking very dubious and incomprehensible objectives. So this is the New York Times, which I think also took up this theme of cold feet among the generals. And then here it is: Trump considers targeted strike against Iran, followed by a larger attack. And here it says President Trump has told advisors that if diplomacy or any initial targeted U.S. attack does not lead Iran to give in to his demands that it give up its nuclear program, he will consider a much bigger attack in coming months intended to drive the country's leaders from power. Though no final decision has been made, advisors said Mr. Trump has been leaning towards conducting an initial strike in coming days intended to demonstrate to Iran's leaders that they must be willing to agree to give up the ability to make a nuclear weapon. So that's the zero enrichment, I guess. Targets under consideration range from the headquarters of Iran's IRGC and the country's nuclear sites to the ballistic missile program. But as I say, IRGC, the ballistic missile programs have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. And as far as the nuclear sites are concerned, there's no enrichment that's going on there. I mean, they were very heavily damaged, so there's no enrichment that's taking place right now. Should these steps fail to convince Tehran to meet his demands, Mr. Trump told advisors he would leave open the possibility of a military assault later this year intended to help topple Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And then there are doubts even inside the administration about whether that goal can be accomplished. With airstrikes alone and behind the scenes, a new proposal is being considered by both sides that could create an off ramp to military conflict, a very limited nuclear enrichment program that Iran could carry out solely for the purposes of medical research and treatment. And during the discussion of the operation last month to seize President Maduro of Venezuela, General Kane told Mr. Trump there was a high likelihood of success, but General Kane has not been able to deliver the same reassurances to Mr. Trump during the Iran discussions, in large measure because it is a far more difficult target. Earlier, the United States had been considering options that including putting teams of special operations forces on the ground that could carry out raids to destroy Iranian nuclear or missile facilities. That included manufacturing and enrichment operations buried far below the surface, outside the range of American conventional munitions. But any such raid would be highly dangerous, requiring special operations forces to be on the ground far longer than they were for the raid to capture Mr. Maduro. Multiple U.S. officials said that for now the plans for commando raid had been shelved. And then, uh, and anyway, so it's all of this is very very strange because the deal that Iran is offering, which is a very low level of enrichment, and from other newspaper reports that we discussed in previous days, they're going to say put it on the back burner so that they won't start enrichment until about 5 years have elapsed. Um, those are very reasonable deals, and certainly Trump can walk away from such a deal and say, "Hey, well, this is a better deal than the JCPOA." But the goal of zero enrichment does seem to be kind of unattainable. I just don't see that Iran would give that up. Um, because if you give that up, then obviously the next demand will be give up your ballistic missiles. I mean, that's just without question, that's what that would happen. Um, so that, but the you see the generals, they don't quite know what is this supposed to do. So I mean, even if they have some kind of a plan in place, such as sending in the commandos to seize Khamenei, I don't know what are they going to do with him. I mean, I don't know where you're going to take him. And even if you go in to kill Khamenei, then what? The government isn't going to collapse because they've lost Khamenei. So the kind of Maduro-like operation, I don't see what that can accomplish. But anyway, in light of these reports that the generals seem to be a little skeptical, Trump sent out. Where are we? Yeah, Trump sent out a. Yes, he sent out this truth, and yesterday, and he says numerous stories from the fake news media have been circulating, stating that General Daniel Kane, sometimes referred to as Raisin, is against us going to war with Iran. The story does not attribute this vast wealth of knowledge to anyone and is 100% incorrect. General Kane, like all of us, would like not to see war, but if a decision is made on going against Iran at a military level, it is his opinion that it will be something easily won. Well, that's very interesting when, here's Trump speaking on someone else's behalf. How do you know that's his opinion? I mean, shouldn't we hear it from Kane himself? It is his opinion that it will be something easily won. This is a four-star general. You're speaking on his behalf. He knows Iran well in that he was in charge of Midnight Hammer, the attack on the Iranian nuclear development. It is a development no longer, but rather was blown to smithereens by our great B 2 bombers. So, that, of course, does raise the question. So, if it was smashed to smithereens, why are why is the United States planning on yet another onslaught against Iran? You just said it was smashed to smithereens, which that means boom, that's it. There's no nuclear development. So nuclear development, you said your goal is Iran must not have nuclear weapons. Um, then, but you say, well, okay. Then so what are you doing? So if you're saying you want regime change, if you want to say, okay, well, I want regime change, okay, then whom do you want to see installed in Tehran? I mean, at least with in other cases, when the United States pursued regime change, when he declared Gaddafi must go, Assad must go, Milosevic must go, Saddam Hussein must go. Well, I mean, usually the United States had at least some leaders in mind, potential leaders in mind that they would install in place. But he hasn't spelled any of that. Is that so? Is your goal is to get the Shah's idiot son in power in Tehran? But anyway, so he suddenly he kind of blurts out, well, it's smashed to smithereens, and yet you want to have no nuclear weapons. By our great B 2 bombers. Raisin Kane is a great fighter and represents the most powerful military anywhere in the world. He has not spoken of not doing Iran or even the fake limited strikes that I have been reading about. He only knows one thing: how to win. And if he's told to do so, he will be leading the pack. It's a very defensive, you have to look at this truth, it's very defensive. He's saying, he says it'll be easily won. That's his opinion. You're speaking on his behalf. And then he says, he knows only one thing: how to win. And if he's told to do so, he will be leading the pack. Well, I would imagine. I mean, if he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he has to do as he's told. I mean, so for him to say, "Oh, well, he'll do as he's told," well, I would hope so. It's kind of what we expect from any general, that he's going to do what the president orders him to do. Everything that has been written about a potential war with Iran has been written incorrectly and purposefully so. I am the one that makes a decision. I would rather have a deal than not. But if we don't make a deal, it will be a bad day for that country, and very sadly, its people, because they are great and wonderful, and something like that should never have happened to them. So they're great and wonderful people, but I'm going to smash them into the ground, blow them up, and it's all their fault. But they're great and wonderful people. I love them. I love the Iranian people. They're great and wonderful. But if needs be, I'm going to just extinguish their lives. So where are we now? We're probably in very much the same place. I do believe, I mean, it would make sense that there are generals who are in doubt about all of this. But Trump may figure that hitting Iran is a freebie in the United States, and that even if it sustains casualties, so I'm like saying, yeah, there's the argument if there are American casualties, maybe he's going to have political problems at home with his base. That's a possibility. There's also a possibility that that given what's almost 50 years of relentless anti-Ayatollah propaganda within the American media, that he will only suffer minimal loss of support. Um, Trump backed away in Minnesota. He may have thought that would be a costly uh, politically for him to continue with his policies in Minnesota. Um, but he they think that he's not going to lose politically in when it comes to Iran, because the right that he was worried about, the kind of anti-interventionist populist right from last year, is much weaker than he was. I mean, there's Tucker Carlson. He ordered Tucker Carlson to make nice with all of the pro-Israel forces in, in the Trump coalition. He said, hey, you got to make nice with them, and hence the interview with Huckabee. Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's gone. She's not in Congress anymore. Thomas Massey. Well, I don't know whether Thomas Massey will be re-elected, but he's now been subjected to constant, relentless attacks from Trump. Bannon, I mean, he's just a brown noser. I mean, he's just whatever Trump wants, Bannon will deliver for him. And Charlie Kirk, well, he's dead. So that kind of right-wing populist opposition that was quite noisy last June, that it just doesn't seem to be anything like as effective today. Anyway, let me now go to our locals page and address the questions from Gagglers. These are the people, the members of our community who are very concerned about the dogs, whether the dogs are getting adequately compensated, remunerated for all the hard work that they put in. And so, I really appreciate all of the members of our locals community. So thank you so much. And the dogs, I wish they would once express their gratitude, but they're dogs. It's not in their nature. Anyway, so thank you, everybody who contributed to the tip jar. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And here is first is Shopronka. Welcome, Shopronka. And so Shopronka highlights Abby Martin's nightmare-inducing film about the military's unstoppable pollution of our planet. Okay, I'll take a look at that. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. Thank you. And Danaki, good evening, Danaki, says, happy anniversary, George, for the 3-week special needs policing of going into the 5th year now. What is amazing, though, is that the less bright among us took about 2 years to see through the COVID BS. Yet, astonishingly, there are still legions of morons that even today take the words of fan fiction Xenon extraordinaires such as Duran, Escobar, Ritter, Martianov, like the gospel. Truly amazing, this blind faith in Xenon, copium, and hopium. I kind of agree with you, and I talked obviously at length my take at the start of this live stream. I think the reason for that, for the people that you've listed, is the power of wishful thinking. They want something to be true, therefore they convince themselves and convince others that it is true. And of course, there's money in it because I think there are many, many people, all around the world who want to believe that Russia's wiping the floor with NATO, that there's a new axis in the world, with BRICS, and there'll be new reserve currency, and new global financial institutions, and everything will be taken away from the power of the West, and that Russian victory of NATO is inevitable. And it's gone on. I mean, this is it's an article of faith. And to be honest, I kind of thought really from about I mean, well, I think at the very least from the time of the Ukrainian kind of counteroffensive of September 2022, it became obvious to me that this is going to be a long, long military campaign. And that is always a bad thing. That is always very, very dangerous, with a very uncertain outcome. And that's why you're right that it is so strange that despite all of that, despite all of the claims in early 2022, we all saw Doug McGregor, uh, you know, being positive, explaining definitively the war is over, Russia has won, fantastic victory, or Martianov's ravings, and we had him on here. I think we had a couple of 2, 3 podcasts with Martianov. I mean, just I thought at the time it was kind of Looney Tunes. Um, and the rest of them. They wanted to believe something, and they insisted on doing it. Now, okay, that's understandable. You want to believe something, that's fine. But after a certain amount of time that's elapsed, you kind of need to readjust your thinking, and that hasn't happened, unfortunately. So, since I'm not in the prediction business, but I will venture a prediction. In a year's time, we'll be here, the 5-year anniversary. This war will not be over. That's of course, if if we don't get into a nuclear war between now and then. But as things stand, I mean, as I said earlier, as things stand, unless something very drastic changes, unless Russia changes its policy very drastically, which it doesn't look like it's going to do, then this war will continue. And I think the momentum is not with Russia. Anyway, thank you so much, Danaki. Thank you for all of your contributions. You really make this um, locals community very vibrant. So thank you so much. And then David Rogers says, "Good evening, Gagglers. Want to convey thanks for the film last night and also the highly enlightening commentary from Cynthia, especially shades of Cahiers du Cinéma." Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. I think I always say this, that Cynthia's contributions are, extremely knowledgeable and, as you put it, enlightening commentary, observations, um, and critiques are just are quite amazing, and they so enhance incredibly our enjoyment of the film. So I'm glad you and many other gagglers are appreciative of Cynthia's contributions. And then David says, "Were the secret society scenes in Eyes Wide Shut true to real life at all? Some top conspiracy analysts, for example, David Icke, have stated that these events did indeed happen." Well, I don't know. I mean, the film itself, and I think as Cynthia explained yesterday, is based on a novella written by Arthur Schnitzler. I think it was written in the 1920s. Either way, it's a long time ago, and the film follows fairly close. I mean, it makes some changes, but it follows fairly closely the Schnitzler novella, and there is some kind of a orgy that takes place in the novella. Now, my problem with the film, why I'm a little skeptical of it, is that you can't just simply take one set of events in one era and then transpose it into another era. In this case, it would be what, about 75 years later. So the what might have been startling and shocking in the 1920s really ceases to be startling and shocking in the 1990s, which is why the film has a kind of a weirdness about it, because in the 1990s is already a generation after the sexual revolution of the 1960s. So the various things that were said and the various scenes that are depicted are already a little bit corny. I mean, we all know this kind of thing, and everyone is familiar with sexual fantasies and swapping of sexual partners and so on and so forth. That this is it's all part of the sexual revolution. So what might have been a little shocking in the 1920s, imagine, hey, there's an orgy, and all sorts of things take place in this orgy, and people, their fantasies are fulfilled, and the swapping of partners and whatnot. I mean, back then that would have seemed quite startling. The 1990s, it's kind of old hat, and that's why the scenes of the orgy there just seem so boring. You can say, well, you can get all this in any kind of routine porn movie. I mean, there's nothing very interesting about this. So the film, I think, is interesting. I mean, everything Kubrick does is quite interesting. I mean, aesthetically, it was interesting. The story itself, however, I was less than impressed by. But as I say, I think you can't really just transpose one story from one era, because that was kind of the time when Europeans discovered that sex really underlay everything. I mean, that was Freud, that was Nietzsche. They kind of broke kind of intellectual ground at the end of the 19th century, saying that all our deepest impulses are driven by suppressed sexual desires, and so when these sexual desires suddenly manifest themselves, then all sorts of terrible things happen. So that was then, but hey, we're kind of many years on, and so by the 1990s, this all seems just kind of passe. Anyway, that was my take. I mean, people are, of course, free to disagree with me, but I think as a film, I think it's interesting. Kubrick is always interesting, but as a story, I was less than overwhelmed by it. And here is the Cynthia herself. Just we were talking about you, and how valuable all of your contributions are. So, yes, Cynthia, thank you so much, Cynthia, again. For those extraordinary contributions. That just we always learn so much about the films and film history and film production, and indeed all of the many aspects of filmmaking and that are involved. And that's why I think was it David mentioned about Cahiers du Cinéma, which highlighted everything that was involved in filmmaking. So it wasn't just simply the actors or the director. It's a big project that filmmaking constitutes. So and you point this out to us every week. So thank you so much, Cynthia. Anyway, Cynthia says, in the wake of Huckabee's unrepudiated statements, yes, that's it, unrepudiated, yeah, Trump has neither denounced nor contradicted them. Nope, he hasn't. The position effectively stands as U.S. policy. How can Saudi Arabia and other Sunni states support a U.S. attack on Iran when the embassy asserts Israel is entitled to their territory. Yet they must understand that if US Imperial Israel overpowers Iran, they'll be next, with no alliance of equals within the Abraham Accords, treated as a vassals and junior partners unless they resist. All of that is correct. Now, uh, it, it is true that Huckabee was kind of hapless in that discussion because he didn't actually advocate that Israel should take over all of this territory. I mean, the way Tucker set this up was saying, well, if you're going to make a point about this God's covenant with Abraham and this land that was promised to Abraham's people, then if that's going to be your argument for the state of Israel, as it was, because Huckabee is making a case based on on biblical grounds. If that's going to be your argument, then of course that's surely that's it's from the Nile to the Euphrates. That's one big chunk of land, and so um, you know, does is Israel entitled to all of this? And he kind of said, well, yeah, in principle, yeah, that's fine. But I don't think he really meant that. I think he just said it, in the heat of an argument, because then he backed away and said, yeah, but we're not talking about that because Israel doesn't really want that. So he accepts in principle, yeah, I wouldn't have any problem with that, but Israel isn't really seeking that. Now, that's so he was kind of trapped into making that statement. Now, that doesn't mean that the Trump administration doesn't have a responsibility to clarify um, what Huckabee said, because I think they should have issued a statement saying that um, Israel has no right to all of this land. But of course, Trump has never really clarified what Israel is entitled to, because up until uh, the Trump administration, U.S. policy had been, well, at least since the Oslo Accords, the U.S. policy has been the two-state solution, which means an Israeli state next to a Palestinian state. Now, Trump has abandoned that. Trump is no longer committed to a Palestinian state, though he mumbles something about Palestinian self-determination. But he's not committed to a Palestinian state. So presumably, he would not have problems with Israel. I mean, in theory, he hasn't said it, but in theory, you might think that he wouldn't have problems with Israel taking over the state of the territory of the mandatory Palestine, and calling that the state of Israel. I mean, in principle, you could see he might think, okay, that's fine. Somebody might persuade him. Yeah, well, that was Palestine was promised to the Jews. He might believe that. It's not true, of course, but he might believe that. However, I don't see Trump going along with territory of the Nile to the Euphrates. I just don't quite see that he would go that far. But apart from anything else, there just aren't enough Israelis to occupy all of that territory. That's a lot of territory, and the population of Israel is quite small. It's about between 9 and 10 million. That's not enough people to occupy so much territory. However, given the outrage that was expressed by these Arab states, as you point out, Cynthia, it was absolutely incumbent on the administration, particularly as it's pursuing peace in the Middle East, and particularly as it's pursuing this policy of the board of peace to run Gaza and seeking to entice all of these various Arab states, including Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies and the rest, into this board of peace. It was incumbent on the administration to make clear, no, we do not accept any of this, and that Huckabee was speaking for himself. He was not speaking on behalf of the administration. But not having not done that, then I think it's just yet another source of disappointment. I think they'll feel a kind of there'll be disappointment with the United States, but it would be, not for the first time. Um, and I think these Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies are essentially used to uh, going along with this. They made their beds. They have alliances with the United States. They make all the noises about they believe in the state for the Palestinians, the two-state solution, and so on. But in practical terms, there's not a great deal that they can do about it, and their relationship with the United States is much too valuable. That everything rests on their relationship with the United States. They wouldn't be able to survive without the United States, so they have to swallow it. They have to go around pretending that they care a great deal about the Palestinians, but when push comes to shove, they have to stick with the Americans. Anyway, then Cynthia says Turkey has no interest in the U.S. launching a war on Iran. Nope, it does not. The fallout would hit its borders and destabilize it. Yes. Yet, as Max Blumenthal notes, Ankara's ability to resist is limited. Yeah, exactly the same way with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, even as a NATO member constrained by entrenched elites. Five major families based in Istanbul who dominate regional construction and maintain deep financial ties to Tel Aviv. Who are they and how and when did they become so bound to Israel? Exposing them might generate enough resistance to prevent war. Well, I don't know whether they would prevent war, but Turkey has for long played a crafty double game. Again, they talk about the Islamic world. They talk about how much they care about the Palestinians, how much they despise Israel. They say it was in public. Um, Erdogan professes to be the sort of the leader of the Islamic world. I mean, he regards himself as the real leader of the Islamic world rather than Saudi Arabia, and yet Turkey, maintains extensive, critical economic ties to Israel. Yeah, I mean that's Erdogan plays this game, but Turkey's been playing this game for many many years, and it isn't going to change. Um, Turkey's not going to break with the United States. The United States isn't going to break with Turkey. Turkey is just much too important to NATO. Um, it's just a lot of hypocrisy there. But of course, Turkey was against the war on Iraq. You remember when George W. Bush was planning the invasion of Iraq, and Turkey ruled this out. They said, you can't use any basis on Turkey. You can't use Turkey as any kind of a launching pad for an attack on Iraq, and condemned, George W. Bush's plans and so on. But it didn't make any difference. Turkey went on maintaining good relations with the United States. So just like now, he said, well, Turkey doesn't want a war in Iran. Yeah, of course, Turkey doesn't want a war with Iran. It's not going to change anything. Everything just continues as before. and Turkey will continue to enjoy very beneficial economic relations with Israel. Um, so that's yeah, unfortunately, that's the reality. Anyway, Cynthia then goes on. Max Blumenthal also has warned that if Trump launches a war in Iran, it could still be raging by the time the World Cup, the first ever hosted by the U.S., kicks off. I'm not. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I don't think it's going to be a long war. I mean, I think that whichever way it goes, I think it's always with it's not a war in the way that the war between Russia and Ukraine is a war, in which one side cannot really call it off without essentially losing the war. This will be a war entirely, it's a unilateral war. United States launches this war, and by the same token, the United States can end the war anytime of its choosing. So, in other words, it can easily just do as it has done before with Iran. It launches attacks and then allows Iran to to retaliate in a symbolic way, and then just call it off and say, okay, we've done what we wanted to do, and now it's over. So I don't think that this is going to be a protracted war. See, a war between when there's no real equality between the United States and Iran. I mean, it's the United States is just so much stronger than Iran, and that's why I don't think. I think there's a limit to how much damage Iran can do to the United States. I may be wrong, but I think it's much more like um, I think but like the previous attacks on Iran, which is yeah, you do them, all very very exciting for a few days, and then you say, hey, let's just call it off, and let's see if we can work out some kind of a deal. And I don't think Iran really wants to. Iran just does not. They're very smart. The leaders of Iran. They don't want a long, protracted war with the United States. It's just because they know that's going to be an absolute disaster for Iran. So I don't know. I you know I have a lot of respect for Max, but I'm not sure that that's correct. That it's going to go on until the World Cup. A full scale conflict could overshadow the tournament, disrupt travel, and dominate global headlines, turning what should be a historic celebration into a geopolitical disaster. If Trump cares about the games going smoothly, he would have to reckon with just how catastrophic the timing of the bombing Iran could be. I mean, all of that, I think, is no doubt true. I think it's a crazy idea. It's a horrible idea to attack Iran. I mean, I think it makes no sense on any level. But as I say, I don't think it's going to be going on for a long time. But anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Anne Marie, it's good to see you again, Anne Marie. Anne Marie, of course, is a great musical talent of the Gaggler. He was a very distinguished musical performer who has performed in some of the finest orchestras in the world, worked with some of the best composers and conductors of the recent past, and continues to perform at the highest level in Europe. So always so happy to have Anne Marie among us and to enjoy all of her musical commentary. Always really enjoy it and always learn so much about the intricacies of music and the performance of the very difficult, challenging piece of music, as only she can describe, having been involved in that. So I just posted Schoenberg's Pelléas and Melisande, and I hope Anne Marie will find the time at some point to just add a few words. Whether I don't know whether she's ever played it, but I'd certainly be interested in any experience that she has had playing Schoenberg. I think that would be an extremely difficult task. So anyway, thank you so much, Anne Marie. Always so happy to have you here. And David Rogers, thank you so much for your generosity. Great show. Thank you. Appreciate that. Marty, always good to see you, Marty. And Marty has posted a picture. Ursula von der Leyen is speaking, and Viktor Orban is looking at her, less than impressed. So I was going to talk a little bit about Orban today, but since I talked um, about him yesterday, I didn't want to talk too much about him. But as things stand, Hungary is not supporting the uh, the 90 billion euro loan, and Hungary is not supporting the 20th round of sanctions on Russia because, as Orban points out, we don't actually think this war is a great idea. We don't support Ukraine. We think this war should come to an end. We don't support the sanctions policy. But even, but we've gone along with it. But the minimum we might expect in return is that Ukraine delivers oil that we actually paid for. So this is oil from Russia that is delivered via pipelines going through Ukraine. But Ukraine is continually messing around with these pipelines, so Hungary does not receive its oil. And of course, that serves to increase energy prices. And of course, it serves to fuel inflation, which is exactly what the hope is among on the part of Kiev and on the part of Brussels, that hope, which is that it'll sink Orban's chances of re-election in the election in April. So that's really the plan. And so Orban said, well, as long as you don't put pressure on Zelensky to allow for the flow of oil for our factories and our homes, as long as you don't do that, then I'm not going to support your plans. I'm not going to support your 90 billion euro plan, and I'm not going to support your 20th round of sanctions. So today, on the fourth anniversary of the war, the Europeans trooped off to Kiev, including Ursula von der Leyen, to see Zelensky, and they had to apologize on behalf of Orban. So here we have apologized that we weren't able to come and deliver for you personally the 90 billion euros and the 20th round of sanctions. But they said we will try and get around Orban. We'll find some way to work around Hungary, and who knows? Maybe he'll be out of power in just whatever 48 days or whatever it is. So uh, that's Orban, who has been quite generous in going along with these policies that he obviously doesn't agree with on Ukraine, but I think quite reasonably says, well, I need to get something out of it myself, and delivery of oil that we actually paid for would be a good start. So, hence Orban's skeptical gazing at von der Leyen. Anyway, thank you, Marty. Nice picture. And Robert, good to see you, Robert. Thank you for your generosity. And Robert says, could you discuss the theme of communism in Europe in relation to Soviet communism after World War II, where the Warsaw Pact countries already developing a home, where the Warsaw Pact countries already developing a homegrown communist movements, were they effectively under continued Soviet occupation? Did Moscow install a loyal regime, or did local parties rise to power? What was the true relationship between Soviet communism and indigenous communist movements, alignment, coercion, or some combination? Well, I think that, yeah, I think it's a mixture of both. In Hungary, the communists really had no support at all inside the country after 1945, and was still a lot of bad feeling about the communist regime of 1919. So that was pretty much imposed by the Soviet Union. In Poland, there was an indigenous communist movement. There was at least initially some popular support for the communists. Czechoslovakia also, there was some support for the communists, but the communists did seize power in 1948, even though they were the largest party, but they did seize power in a coup. And I think in places like Bulgaria and Romania, I think the communists did enjoy a measure of support, but they were, um, I think they were largely under the control of the Soviet Union. But it wasn't seen at the time. Oh, they have to do everything the Soviet Union was telling them, because the reputation of Stalin in those days was really, extremely high. He was the victor of World War II. He was the sort of the mastermind of the world communist movement. He had crushed the Wehrmacht, and so I think the communists, I think, genuinely believed him to be, the great man, the great far-seeing leader of the the world communist movement, Lenin's successor, and so there wasn't really such a problem about following the dictates of Stalin. Now, um, admittedly, those years were very harsh. The imposition of communist rule was certainly harsh, and the communists did, at least in Poland and in Hungary, uh, were quite unpopular. And so after Khrushchev's speech in 1956, following the de-Stalinization campaign that started in 1953, immediately after Stalin's death, there, I mean, there was a lot of unhappiness with the communists. I mean, the collectivization of agriculture had obviously been very unpopular. The show trials, the police repression, all of that, had become quite unpopular. Um, and so the therefore in after 56, the at least there was a moment when I think some people thought, well, this is it. We can actually see the communists off, but the Khrushchev, I think, made clear that that wasn't going to happen. So I mean, when we say that it was a mixed bag, um, in Hungary, Poland, clearly the communists were unpopular. Hungary there was a violent attempt to overthrow the communists. That was obviously crushed. Poland, there was also an attempt to overthrow the communists. That was crushed, but not violently. In Czechoslovakia, the protests against the communists, that was kind of delayed. There was that whole, it was a process for some reason. There was a 10-year delay in Czechoslovakia. Finally, they attempted to do so in 1968. But in other places, the communists weren't really hated so much. I mean, Bulgaria, they really weren't hated. Um, East Germany, the communists kind of put down certain roots. They managed to somehow meld communism with a certain measure of kind of German nationalism, German patriotism. So I don't know. I mean, I'd say it was it's an interesting story. I think it's a mixed bag. And I think maybe we could talk a little bit in greater detail about the different communists. And I've actually thought doing a kind of one of our film nights, whether we can talk about films from communist Eastern Europe, some of the best films from communist Eastern Europe, and what they tell us about the different communist regimes in different countries, and and different phases of communist rule, from the Stalin era, the Khrushchev era, the Brezhnev era, and so on. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And Dennis Mister says, just to agree with Danoki and wish you good night. Well, thank you very much. And Robert says, Biden praised Obama as articulate, bright, and clean, meaning admiration, but sounding racially tone deaf. Yep, that happened in 2008. Yesterday, Newsom said, I'm like you, a 960 SAT guy, aiming for relatability, but alluding to stereotype. In both cases, the harder they try to pander to a black audience, the more they step in it. Yes, that's right. And I think that it is a kind of pandering, and it is a way, um, and it always comes across as this as the worst kind of condescension. And I think that's where Trump scores rather well, because Trump never really tries to pander. He's never really tried to be, oh, I'm like you, I'm kind of one of the blacks, and so on. Um, and I think that's why Trump actually does have some appeal among blacks. He never really tries to pander. He never tries to show that he's one of them, and so on. Um, they I mean, Biden is always tone deaf. I mean, everything about him. That's because he's just such a complete phony, as I think is Newsom. um I mean, for him to bring up the SAT thing, I mean, you have to, well, that's probably on his mind. That's what he's thinking about when he talks to blacks. Well, what was your SAT score? I mean, that's what he's thinking about. And of course, what you're thinking about, well, you're going to blurt out. And I think that's just like, what is Biden thinking about when he's talking about blacks? What is that? Clean? Okay, he's probably thinking, well, that maybe they don't take as many showers as we do. Oh, we of course know about Biden having showers with his daughter, but that's a different issue. But it's, when you blurt these things out, you reveal really what's on your mind. Anyway, thank you, Robert. Really appreciate it. And I think my time is now up. Thank you, everybody who have joined me. Thank you so much for all of your really interesting and challenging questions. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to deal with all of them, but we'll be back on Thursday at the same time. Hope to see you all then. I have to deal with the dogs, to, discuss the matter with them, and it's always a difficult. They're not exactly communication friendly, but that's the way it is. So anyway, we'll see you Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Look forward to that. All the best. Good night. Bye bye.